As with all of our other periods, the first thing we have to do is define what romanticism is in comparison to Baroque music or classical music. So what is romanticism and how does it change music? Who are the great composers of the era? And what becomes the popular music of the time? Romanticism is a cultural movement that stresses emotion, individuality, and imagination. Remember, we've gone from a period in time in the Baroque where the courts and the church ruled over the socially acceptable norms, they created the laws, they controlled most of the population. The church had such power in that period that they deemed humans weak and sinful. That power changed during the classical period. It was a time in which composers found more and more freedom. Even if they didn't break completely free from the system, they were able to express more ideas and use more racy and interesting, more human subjects in their music. But they still followed pretty precise rules and also really wrote in only the most specific of popular forms. Society itself had changed. We had a middle class that had risen out of rebellion and war, but it still was growing and was pretty weak in comparison to the courts and the church. At the beginning of the Romantic period is when the church finally lost a lot more of its power and society was finally becoming more and more equalized. Of course, you always will have the rich, the middle class, and the poor, but this was the period in time when the middle class, due to the Industrial Revolution and a lot of other new innovations, was becoming more and more a presence in society that was demanding that people start to look at themselves as equal human beings to each other, and also that would look at humanity as a beautiful, interesting creation that could be both comic and tragic at the same time. Humans were intelligent, but they were emotional. So this movement that was Romanticism was the idea that humans were emotional creatures and that every human was an individual with its own sense of imagination. People believed that this should be celebrated during the Romantic period. Romanticism also rebelled against most rules and social norms. If anyone from any class could become an artist at this point in time, it didn't matter. You had to struggle to survive still against great odds to become a great composer or musician. But the act of the rebellion against social norms was something that was inherent in the movement because it stressed emotion and individuality above laws and rigidness. There was a freedom of expression in every way in the Romantic period, and people really wanted to encompass the entirety of the human experience in art forms. If you look at paintings from the time, they're very full of motion and life and these ideas that humans are full of emotion and that could be captured on a canvas. Composers believed it could be captured in music, whether with the voice or without. This is also a period in which everything is very subjective instead of objective. In other words, from the Baroque and the Classical period, we had a lot of objective music. Music that simply followed a form or a guideline and had no real story or emotion behind it. It was beautiful, but it was sort of simplistic in its ideals. In the Romantic period, this was exactly the opposite. Music became more fantastical and subjective. It became so individualized, every composer had their own style and wrote however they felt that day. That was really the epitome of Romanticism, this idea that every individual had the right to create music or art based off of their own personal experience. So how does Romanticism, this cultural movement that elicits so much more emotion and humanity, change music from the classical music that you heard in the weeks previous to these two? First, remember Beethoven and his music, and then think about the music you listened to last week. There are some big differences between those two types of music, whether you know what those differences are or not. They sound so very different. But Beethoven was the first one who came close to being considered a romantic, especially in his later music. He was a transitional composer that helped other romantic composers because they were inspired by his story, his fight over his deafness, and the fact that his later music had more passion and pain and emotion that came out in it, versus the earlier classical composers of Haydn and Mozart, who wrote lighter, fun, cleaner music that was beautiful, it was complex, but it never went beyond the more simple human emotions. Romantic composers, inspired by Beethoven's struggle and his later music, allowed themselves the freedom he had always wanted. They experimented with their music and their forms of music. You had new sounds and new ideas develop that captivated audiences and became the new popular music. So who were these new great romantic composers? There were so very many romantic composers, we couldn't possibly cover them. Another one of the reasons I had you listen to so many of the composers last week is that I really wanted you to get to know them without having to put a label on them. Now you can learn the names of these great men and women and learn about the forms that they themselves developed so that you can better understand the period. But you can always go back now and listen to romantic music and simply appreciate how much it is individual and emotional. And that's the most important thing to take away from this romantic era of composition. I've listed on this slide the biggest composers and the ones that you listened to last week, the ones we'll talk about a little bit in these lectures. Know that in the book, they really do go into the lives of these composers and talk about how they wrote their music, in particular the listing examples. These lectures this week are not going to cover all of that material, so please make sure that you not only read the book, but that you listen to these lectures that highlight ideas and some of the forms and composers from the book. So we have to ask ourselves, with all of these amazing composers working in this era of music, what was the popular music of the time? Did all of these composers write popular music or use popular forms? Well, this period is a little bit different. All the composers of the era experimented with form and kept expanding older classical forms. So these composers we're going to be talking about that you listened to last week, they all invented new forms. Even ones based off the old classical forms are so different that they are almost like new forms unto themselves. Audiences loved that they had a wide choice of style, sound, and form. Even the size of the group they would be listening to, they could choose. So popular music for the first time in music history was widely varied. Anything could become popular during this period, it seemed. And it really was true. Art songs, operas, etudes, concertos, symphonies, program music, nationalistic music. There were so many different types of forms of music, and there were so many different trends in music that people really appreciated at this time because they wanted music in their homes and on the concert stage as an exciting spectacle to watch. So many of the composers from this era have been forgotten because they weren't the greatest at some of these forms. But I guarantee you that if you go and listen to any romantic composer, they're going to have some similarities in sound because even though they were all experimenting with these forms, they were all creating new forms continuously, they all did have a certain sense of emotionality in their music, of creating beautiful melodies, and there were other characteristics that were used in all of the music. Some of those characteristics were the fact that they did use old familiar forms. It was something that helped the pieces maintain popularity. But the composers, in their own individual way, would expand tone color, pitch range, dynamics, and instrumentation. Audiences still loved beautiful, clean melodies. It's just now they wanted melodies to represent emotional ideas rather than just clean, simple, pretty things to listen to. They wanted more complex harmonies that expressed deeper emotions. I hope you understand the trend that started during this period, that they wanted more complicated music. They wanted something that really reached into the soul, that even could link to the poetry or the literature of the time, something that created more tension than balance, something that always left them wanting more or kept them excited and surprised throughout the listening experience. Audiences still loved classical sound, but they wanted something new. And that's why so many different forms and styles of music and so many composers became very popular during this period and are still popular today. But as I said, there were some characteristics that were very, very particular to Romantic music that helped to make those particular forms and composers more popular. We're going to discuss those characteristics in the next lecture, so feel free to move on at this point to the next lecture.